The porch light was the first thing that bothered me, too bright for a quiet street, too early for bedtime, and somehow already waiting when Daniel turned down the block he never takes after dinner. He'd called it a shortcut, the word tossed out casually while his hand tightened on the wheel, and his phone lit up face down like a heartbeat under glass. We rolled past 3 mailboxes and a sycamore whose roots buckled the curb, and my mind cataloged each detail because something in me had gone from anxious to observant in a single breath. A message chimed on my phone, the screen insisting I look, but I kept my gaze on that pool of light ahead where the walk met the door. He slowed, then sped up again like a man rehearsing a move and backing out at the last second. I told myself we were just passing through, nothing to note, nothing to file away. Yet the light stayed with me, printed behind my eyes. By the time he merged onto the main road, my smile worked on the outside, and my stomach did not. Before I tell you what came of that light and the road it revealed, let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever trusted your gut over someone's excuses. Your support helps stories like mine reach the people who need them. My name is Carolyn, and if you'd met me a year ago, you might have called my life ordinary in a way people mean as praise. A modest house with white shutters that always needed repainting, a husband with a brisk schedule and good suits, a job I loved that didn't impress anyone at cocktail parties. I teach literature at the community college, which is to say I spend my days convincing grown adults their thoughts are worth reading and their voices are worth hearing. And that has always felt like honest work to me. I grew up with a school librarian for a mother and a machinist for a father. People who prized doing things right over being seen doing them. And I carried those values like a lucky coin in my pocket. Daniel came from different stock country club dinners, summers on lakes I only knew from postcards, the kind of family that framed diplomas bigger than wedding photos. He was charming from the first hello, quick with compliments, quicker with plans, and when we married, I believed we were bringing out the best in each other. In the beginning, our differences felt like balance. He liked numbers, I liked stories. He chased the deal, I made soup and graded essays on the couch. He kept an eye on the big picture. I noticed the small things that kept a home standing. We were good at holidays, good at hosting, good at looking like two halves that clicked together without splinters. Chloe fit into that picture easily, the friend I'd known since sophomore English who never once forgot a birthday and was always first to show up with a casserole and a joke that landed. She rented a townhouse 3 blocks away and learned our keypad code without being asked, and on Saturday mornings we'd walk the loop around the park with coffee cups, her ponytail swinging as she told stories that made even errands sound entertaining. Daniel teased her the way brothers tease sisters, and she teased him back, and I folded that into the story I told myself about found family and the luck of a life that still made sense. There were moments, small ones, that tugged at the edges of that story in ways I chose not to name. The way Daniel's phone lived face down on the counter, the way a message could make his voice go softer than any song, the way his attentions sometimes drifted mid-sentence like a kite slipping its string. There was the joke he made at a barbecue about how I'd married into spreadsheets, and we all laughed because marriage is compromise and compromise is funny until it isn't. There was the time Chloe said men get restless if you don't keep things new, and I said something about new recipes while her eyes said something else. I set each moment on an inner shelf and told myself I was being wise, not suspicious that a marriage lasts because you let the wind rattle the windows without assuming the house will fall. It wasn't trust without thought. It was trust on purpose. Our 7th anniversary seemed like a good night to pull us back to center. I made the reservation, wore the dress he'd once said looked like a midnight secret, and wrapped the watch I'd saved for a simple classic face he could check between meetings. He had that taut look people wear when they're somewhere and somewhere else at once, and his phone found his hand between bites the way an old habit finds an old scar. Still, he kissed my cheek, thanked me for the gift, and said we should plan a weekend away soon. And if his eyes felt a step behind his words, I decided to meet him where he'd stood with me so many times before. If you give a person the benefit of the doubt often enough, it starts to feel like a mutual vow. We left the restaurant as the air cooled and the streetlights clicked on, and he drove like a man who knew a better way home that hadn't existed the week before. When he called it a shortcut, I nodded and threaded my fingers together tight in my lap. And that's when the porch light appeared at the end of a block. I could have walked with my eyes closed. It wasn't the only light on our street, and it wasn't the prettiest, but it was the kind that says somebody's expecting someone. My phone buzzed again, and the preview flashed a name that has lived in my phone longer than my married name has lived on my driver's license. I didn't open it. I watched the glow at the walkway as we slid by, slow enough to notice, fast enough to deny. Daniel merged back into familiar traffic, the kind that hums you toward your normal life, whether you deserve it or not, and I pressed my tongue to the back of my teeth to keep from saying what a different version of me might have said. I told myself it was late, that lights come on for 100 reasons, that messages can wait until morning when everything looks softer. But the drive home had already done its work, and I understood something I wasn't ready to speak out loud. Some lights don't come on by accident, and once you've seen them, your house never looks the same in the dark. The morning after that uneasy drive, Daniel slipped into the kitchen as if the world had never shifted. His shirt was crisp, his tie already knotted, and the smell of his cologne mixed with the steam from his coffee. He kissed my cheek, the way he always did, light and thoughtless, and told me dinner the night before had been wonderful. My lips formed the words, "Yes, it was," but inside I nearly laughed. Wonderful. He had steered us through Chloe's street like a man who knew where he belonged, and then curled into our bed hours later as if nothing were amiss. I held my mug close, the heat warming my palms while I studied his ease. He poured cereal, hummed under his breath, and glanced at the news scrolling across his phone. Not a trace of guilt touched his face. He even smiled when he mentioned plans for the weekend, like he hadn't left me alone on the night meant to celebrate us. I gave him nothing in return, no hint that my eyes had been wide open, and that silence gave me a kind of control I hadn't felt before. When he left for the office, briefcase in hand, I sat at the table staring at the small rectangle of wood where his elbow had rested. My phone buzzed again, the glow of Chloe's name bright against the morning light. She wanted to reschedule brunch, claimed a migraine had knocked her down. I read the words 3 times, remembering her porch light, her loose robe, and her hair that hadn't looked sick at all. I set the phone face down on the counter, my knuckles whitening against the ceramic. She was lying to me with the same ease Daniel had, and the realization settled into my chest like a stone. For the next several days, I let the two of them believe I was none the wiser. I cooked the same dinners, folded the same laundry, and offered the same smiles when he walked through the door. At night, when the house quieted and he stepped into the shower, I waited until the water masked the sound of his phone unlocking. Notifications popped up one after another, and there it was, her name. Last night was perfect. Same time tomorrow. My stomach twisted, but my hands stayed steady as I scrolled through weeks of messages. They teased each other, shared jokes I wasn't part of, and booked hotels under both their names. There were pictures, too, ones I couldn't unsee. Proof that what I feared wasn't just suspicion. His voice carried from the steam-filled bathroom. "Babe, can you grab me a towel?" I locked the phone, set it exactly where I found it, and forced my voice to sound normal. "Sure." My reflection in the mirror looked foreign, hollow around the eyes, but burning behind them. That was the night I decided I needed more than instincts and screenshots. I needed proof that couldn't be twisted or denied. The following evening, he told me he'd be working late. I smiled, nodded, and asked him not to push himself too hard. When he drove away, I waited 10 minutes, then followed at a distance, my headlights off, until the last possible moment. He didn't head toward the office, not even close. His car rolled confidently into Chloe's driveway, the porch light glowing once again like a stage set just for him. I parked where the trees gave me cover, lifted my phone, and pressed record. His car in the driveway, his figure walking to the door, Chloe greeting him with a look that spoke louder than words. My hand shook not from weakness, but from the weight of certainty. I filmed until the door closed, until the house swallowed them both, then lowered the phone to my lap and sat in silence. The grief that followed nearly crushed me. My chest tightened, my breaths came shallow, and for a few minutes I wanted to scream into the night until someone, anyone, came running. But anger followed quickly, cold and steady, cutting through the haze. I realized then that tears and shouts would only give them the story they wanted, the foolish wife too emotional to be believed. I drove away, parked at a gas station on the edge of town, and stared at the footage playing back on my phone. That moment marked a shift inside me. I wasn't helpless anymore. I was gathering the first stones for the wall I would build between them and everything they thought they had stolen from me. The next afternoon, Chloe knocked on my door carrying a bottle of wine. She sat on my couch, legs crossed, and asked with feigned sweetness how our anniversary had been. I forced a smile and told her Daniel had spoiled me, though the words burned like acid. She clinked her glass against mine, laughing, as if it were our shared joke. I watched her phone buzz on the table, saw her flip it face down with a casual motion, and knew whose name had flashed across the screen. I clinked my glass back, hiding the storm in my chest. That night, I went further. I logged into our joint bank account, scrolling line after line until my vision blurred. Transfers I didn't recognize, withdrawals I hadn't made, thousands disappearing into an account I had never seen. My throat closed as I matched receipts in his email, hotel bookings, jewelry dinners, for 2 gifts that never reached me. He wasn't just betraying me with his body. He was financing their fantasy with our money. I printed every statement, every receipt, and slid them into a folder under my desk. Evidence. Not just of betrayal, but of theft. Lying beside him later, his arm draped heavy across my waist. I stared at the ceiling and felt the last pieces lock into place. This wasn't weakness or a passing temptation. This was planned, deliberate, and carefully hidden. The man I trusted had conspired with the woman I called my closest friend, and together they were bleeding me of everything I believed was ours. His touch no longer felt like closeness, it felt like chains. And in that silence, I promised myself one thing: they had no idea who they were up against. 2 nights later, he stumbled through the door, close to midnight, shirt untucked, and excuses spilling out about late meetings and demanding clients. I smiled, touched his arm lightly, and told him not to worry. The next morning, over eggs and coffee, I tested him. Chloe suggested we take a girls' trip, just the 2 of us. What do you think? His spoon froze for the briefest second, then he smiled too quickly and said it sounded fun, that I deserved it. I sipped my coffee and let him believe I was still the blind wife who trusted his every word. The next week, Chloe invited me over for a wine night. We sat in her kitchen, candles flickering, her voice too bright as she asked about Daniel. I met her gaze, calmly told her things were fine, and let the silence stretch. Her phone buzzed, his name glowing on the screen before she flipped it over. My lips curved into a quiet smile she didn't recognize. That was the moment grief gave way to clarity. Everything I had suspected was now undeniable. My husband and my best friend weren't just lying, they were dismantling my life with precision. But if they thought I would crumble under the weight of their secrets, they were wrong. That night, sitting alone in my car before driving home, I whispered to myself that this wasn't going to end in slammed doors or tearful confrontations. It was going to end where they least expected it, in court. And as I turned the key in the ignition, one thought carried me through the darkness. If they wanted to play games, They had no idea how dangerous silence could be. At night, I lay in our bed, staring at the ceiling, while Daniel breathed heavily beside me, his arm draped across my waist, as if nothing had changed. His touch used to feel steady, a comfort in the dark, but now it pressed on me like a weight I couldn't shift. My mind replayed every scene, the porch light flicking on his jacket, tossed carelessly on Chloe's couch, the messages I'd read with shaking hands. Each detail circled like a vulture, coming back to remind me of what I already knew. I felt hollow, and yet, underneath that emptiness, something sharp was forming, a kind of steady fire that didn't flare or burn out. In the daylight, I moved carefully, keeping my face soft, my voice calm. I asked about his day, stirred sugar into my coffee, and smiled when he cracked the same old jokes he thought still charmed me. Inside, though, the silence grew heavier. It wasn't just betrayal between him and Chloe. It was the way they carried on so confidently, mocking me in their lies, believing I was too blind to see. I washed dishes, folded laundry, went to work, and the motions of my life blurred together. But in the quiet moments, the weight pressed hardest, and I would have to set my hands flat on the counter just to steady myself. The grief came in waves. Some nights I cried quietly into my pillow, waiting until he shifted deeper into sleep so he wouldn't hear me. Other times the tears refused to come at all, leaving me staring into the dark with dry eyes that burned from holding back. I'd think about the girl I had been when I said my vows, how certain she was that storms could be weathered if two people faced them together. That girl felt far away now, naive, and almost unrecognizable. What had been built over years of effort could be undone in whispers and shadows, and I felt the loss of that truth more than the marriage itself. Chloe's presence only deepened the ache. She came by one evening with a smile, carrying a pie she claimed she had baked for us. She moved through my kitchen like she belonged there, opening cabinets and pulling out plates as if nothing were wrong. We sat at the table, the three of us, and she laughed easily at Daniel's stories. I studied her face in the glow of the overhead light, remembering how she had once leaned close on my porch with wine in hand, warning me that men like Daniel got bored easily. At the time, I brushed it off as one of her careless remarks. Now it replayed in my mind with new meaning. After she left, I sat alone at the table with the uneaten pie, my fork resting against the plate. Rage bubbled beneath the surface, but it stayed locked in place. I had learned to hold my tongue to keep my movements controlled, because giving either of them the satisfaction of a reaction was the one thing I refused to do. When Daniel came in later, loosening his tie and asking if I wanted to watch a show, I shook my head and said I was tired. He kissed my forehead and went to change, never suspecting that my silence wasn't weakness, it was armor. During the day, I graded essays, my red pen moving mechanically across the pages, but my mind wandered back to our bank statements tucked in the folder under my desk. Each number glared back at me when I revisited them at night, proof that his betrayal wasn't only emotional. He had used what we built together to fund what he thought would stay hidden. The evidence stacked neatly in that folder became a strange kind of comfort, a reminder that I wasn't losing my mind. Still, I kept it locked away where he would never see it. I began to notice how often Daniel watched me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. His eyes lingered a second too long over breakfast, as though he was checking for cracks. "You've been quiet lately," he said one morning, his spoon resting in his bowl. I smiled faintly and told him I was fine, just busy with work. He seemed satisfied with that, returning to his phone, but I caught the flicker of relief that passed over his face. That flicker told me everything he suspected nothing. The loneliness crept in slowly, heavier than I expected. I stopped answering phone calls from my mother because I didn't trust my voice not to break. I canceled coffee with colleagues claiming deadlines when really I couldn't stand the thought of sitting across from someone and pretending my life was intact. At night, I paced the kitchen floor in bare feet, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock on the wall. It was in those hours that the questions pressed hardest. How long had it been going on? When had the shift started? And how had I missed it? The betrayal wasn't only about Daniel or Chloe. It was about me, too, about the trust I had given so freely, and the blindness I had wrapped around myself like a blanket. I thought of the summers we'd spent hosting barbecues, the way Chloe had stood at my side refilling drinks, her laugh mixing with his. How many of those evenings had been built on lies? The humiliation was almost worse than the heartbreak, knowing that everyone around us might have seen something I didn't. Some nights, I considered confronting them both at once, dragging the truth out into the open so it couldn't be hidden anymore. I pictured myself standing in Chloe's doorway, watching their faces crumble under the weight of exposure. But each time I reached that point in my imagination, I stopped. Anger was fleeting, but patience that could build something lasting. I reminded myself again and again that silence was my shield, and time was quietly working in my favor. The distance between Daniel and me grew in ways he didn't notice. His late nights became routine, his excuses well-rehearsed. When he climbed into bed, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine, I turned onto my side and let him believe I was asleep. I listened to the rhythm of his breathing until I knew he was lost to it, and then I opened my eyes to the dark ceiling. That dark space became a mirror of my own restraint. I knew I couldn't live in this suspended place forever. Something inside me was shifting, preparing. The grief had worn its course, hollowing me out, until what remained was something sharper, steadier. I wasn't ready to move yet, but the quiet planning had already begun, as natural as breathing. I tucked away receipts, memorized small details, and let the weight of their lies carve me into someone stronger than either of them expected. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't tell Chloe. Instead, I let them both think they had won. My silence became the mask they believed, and behind it, the shape of my plan started to take form. And in those still nights, when I could hear the faint whistle of wind through the shutters, I promised myself that grief had done its work. What came next would no longer be about heartbreak. It would be about clarity. And clarity, once it settles in, becomes dangerous. The shift came so quietly that even I almost missed it. One evening, Daniel returned home close to midnight. His shirt creased the faint trace of perfume clinging to him. He muttered something about a client dinner and dropped his briefcase by the door. I looked up from the book in my lap and asked if he was exhausted. He blinked, surprised by my calmness, then nodded quickly and kissed my forehead before disappearing into the shower. That night, as the water ran, I lay back against the pillows with a certainty I hadn't felt before. I wasn't going to scream, cry, or beg for answers anymore. I was done being the unsuspecting wife. The next morning, over breakfast, I stirred sugar into my coffee while Daniel scrolled through his phone. I glanced at him and asked, "Late night?" He hesitated, just for a beat, then said it had been a long dinner with clients. His voice was steady, but I caught the small shift in his posture, the way he studied me, as though searching for cracks. I smiled, told him I was glad he worked so hard for us, and watched the relief spread across his face. He truly believed I still had no idea. In that moment, I knew I had the advantage, and I wasn't going to give it up. Later that week, Chloe called me in her familiar syrupy voice. "Babe, you've been so quiet. Everything okay?" she asked. I forced a light laugh and told her I was just buried in grading papers. She suggested we book a spa day together, her treat as if nothing was unraveling. My grip tightened on the phone, but I kept my tone cheerful and agreed. After I hung up, my hand shook with rage. She wasn't only lying, she was rubbing it in, offering me scraps from the money Daniel funneled to her, as though I should be grateful. But instead of breaking, I opened my laptop and started searching for something else entirely. Divorce attorneys, private investigators, professionals who could help me turn this quiet rage into something precise. 2 nights later, I tried silence as a tool. Daniel poured himself a drink, asked why I was so quiet, and studied me with that probing look again. I smiled softly and told him everything was fine. He frowned, searching for a slip, but I had built my mask too carefully. I realized then that the more he underestimated me, the easier it would be to dismantle everything he thought he controlled. And from that night on, silence wasn't just my shield, it was my weapon. The turning point came a few days later. He walked into the bedroom with his jacket slung over his arm and his phone still in hand, muttering about another late night at the office. I tilted my head, watching him closely, and asked if he wanted me to wait up. He froze for the briefest second, then chuckled and said, "No, I shouldn't bother." I set the laundry basket down, told him to be safe, and left it at that. 2 small words, "be safe," were enough to seal something inside me. This was the last time I would play the role of the naive wife, waiting for crumbs of his attention. That night, I packed a small overnight bag with only what I needed. When Daniel came home reeking of Chloe's perfume, I sat him down and said I felt overwhelmed. I told him I needed space, maybe a little time at my sister's house just to clear my head. His surprise faded quickly, replaced by a smug sort of relief. He thought he'd won, that my leaving made things easier for him. He patted my hand and told me to take all the time I wanted. I smiled faintly, hiding the fire building inside me, and thanked him for being so understanding. That was the night I walked out of our house, not because I was broken, but because I finally had room to prepare. At my sister's guest room, I spread the folder across the bed. Screenshots, bank records, photos of his car in Chloe's driveway, every scrap I had gathered over weeks. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a beginning. I took a pen and wrote 3 words at the top of the folder. Everything from him. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about taking back what was mine and stripping him of everything he thought made him untouchable. The following morning, Daniel called me, his voice warm and rehearsed. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I told him I was coping, that I just needed time, and he sighed heavily as though the weight of our marriage rested on his shoulders alone. He promised to keep things steady while I was gone. I nearly laughed at the irony, but kept my voice low and fragile, letting him believe he was still in control. When I hung up, I knew for certain that the balance had shifted. By that afternoon, I was sitting across from a divorce attorney in a navy suit, his desk stacked with case files. He peered at me over his glasses and asked why I was there. I slid the folder across to him, every receipt and message laid out for his review. His expression tightened as he flipped through each page. "This is solid," he said at last. "Infidelity cases can be tricky, but with this documentation and the financial transfers, we can build a strong case." I leaned forward and told him I didn't just want out. I wanted everything: the house, the accounts, my independence secured. He nodded slowly and promised we could build a case for both adultery and financial fraud. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of direction. That evening, Daniel called again, his tone dripping with false warmth. I played my role perfectly, telling him I was still fragile, that I needed more time. He reassured me and promised we would figure things out. I clenched my jaw to keep from laughing. He had no idea the figuring was already done. 2 days later, I met with a private investigator. My attorney recommended a sharp-eyed woman named Angela Price. She flipped through the folder with quick, practiced hands, then looked me squarely in the eye. "Your husband is sloppy," she said. "Men like him always think they're smarter than they are. You want photos, videos, times, dates, you'll have them." I asked how soon, and she smirked, promising a week. I shook her hand, my grip steady, and thanked her. As I left her office, I felt lighter than I had in months. Meanwhile, I continued to play my part. I texted Chloe, casually asked how she was feeling, mentioned maybe meeting for coffee. She responded quickly, cheerful and smug, as though nothing had shifted. Daniel called me later that night, and I deliberately dropped Chloe's name into the conversation. He hesitated only for a fraction of a second before covering it with forced cheer. "That's great," he said. "You two should catch up." I smiled into the phone where he couldn't see, knowing he still believed in the lie I was feeding him. When Angela delivered the manila envelope filled with photos and videos, I felt the final piece fall into place. Images of Daniel slipping into Chloe's house receipts from hotels, time-stamped and undeniable. "This is airtight," she told me. I stared at the evidence, my pulse steady. What had once been grief was now fuel, every detail feeding into the plan I had built brick by brick. That night, as I sat alone with the envelope spread before me, I realized that this wasn't just a matter of survival or heartbreak anymore. I wasn't merely the wife he betrayed or the friend she mocked. I had become the woman they underestimated, and that was their greatest mistake. And as I gathered the papers back into the folder, I whispered to myself that what came next would not be quiet. It would not be merciful. It would be the end they never saw coming. I kept the envelope Angela handed me in plain sight on the nightstand, though Daniel would never know it was there. The weight of it wasn't only paper, it was certainty, the kind that steadied my breath when I felt my chest tighten. Every detail, every timestamp, every receipt had become a brick in the wall I was building. But walls weren't enough. If I wanted justice, I needed to step forward, and I needed to do it in a way that left no room for doubt. The first step was financial. I stopped depositing my paychecks into the joint account and redirected them to a new account in my name only. Each time I logged in and saw the balance grow, a quiet relief spread through me. Daniel never noticed. He was too consumed with shifting money around to fund his secret life. I made copies of everything: bank statements, mortgage documents, utility bills, then tucked them away in a separate folder. These weren't just records. They were my leverage, each page proof of how far his deceit had reached. I started planting seeds in conversations too. When my mother-in-law called to ask how we were, I told her Daniel seemed distracted lately. She sighed and said he worked too much, that he needed to slow down and appreciate me. I agreed softly, adding only that he had other priorities right now. It was just enough to stir her worry to let a quiet crack form in the image of her perfect son. Each small remark was deliberate, controlled the way you'd guide water toward the edge of a dam and wait for it to seep through. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances with Chloe. She invited me over for a girls' night, all wine and laughter, as though our friendship hadn't been hollowed out from the inside. I sat across from her, listening to her stories, nodding when she spoke, letting her believe she still had me fooled. When she complimented me on looking rested, I told her the time away had given me perspective. Her smile faltered for half a second, though she quickly covered it with a laugh. I saw it. That flicker told me she wasn't as sure of herself as she pretended to be. Daniel, on the other hand, was smug. He called often, asking if I was ready to come back, telling me he missed me, that things would be different once I returned. I matched his tone, soft and uncertain, promising I was still thinking about it. He thought he was in control. He thought I was drifting away slowly, ready to come back when he decided the time was right. That belief kept him careless, and carelessness was the one gift I needed from him most. By the end of the month, my attorney had the case fully built: adultery, dissipation of marital assets, even the possibility of fraud. "You'll get the house," he told me. "You'll get the accounts. And depending on how the judge rules, he may owe you alimony too." I let his words settle in my chest, steady and heavy. This wasn't just about leaving anymore. It was about reclaiming every piece of myself they had tried to take. The night before we filed, Daniel called me again. His voice carried a false tenderness, the kind he used when he wanted to sell me on something. "Maybe you should move back in," he said. "We can reset. Start fresh." I closed my eyes and smiled where he couldn't see me. "Maybe," I whispered. "I'll think about it." He exhaled with relief, mistaking my words for surrender. I hung up, staring at the documents spread across the table. I didn't miss him. I didn't even hate him anymore. What I felt was sharper than that resolve. When the papers were filed, Daniel stormed into my sister's house with his fists clenched, waving the documents like a weapon. "You blindsided me," he shouted, his voice shaking with more fear than fury. I stayed seated sipping tea and told him plainly that warning wasn't necessary when the truth spoke for itself. His eyes searched mine, desperate for some sign of the woman who once bent to his will. But she wasn't there anymore, and for the first time, he looked at me with something I hadn't seen before: fear. Fear wasn't enough. I wanted devastation. That's why I planned the dinner. I called his parents, his sister, even an uncle who always praised him as the golden boy of the family. I invited Chloe and Daniel as well, telling them it was a chance to talk things through, a way to clear the air. They arrived dressed like they were attending a celebration, smiles plastered across their faces, holding hands as though their unity was a shield. I let them sit, poured wine, and waited until the table settled into awkward chatter. Then I stood, a folder resting in my hands. I thought tonight would be the right time to share the truth. I began, my voice steady. Daniel frowned, telling me it wasn't necessary, but I slid the first photo across the table. Gasps rippled through the room as his parents saw him and Chloe together, kissing in her driveway. His mother's hand flew to her chest. His sister whispered under her breath, and Daniel's face drained of color. Chloe shifted in her seat, her smile collapsing as quickly as it had been painted on. "This isn't what it looks like," Daniel stammered. I laid down another photo, hotel receipts with both their names, room service for two. Chloe reached for the papers in panic, but I pinned them beneath my hand. My voice was cold when I spoke, sharper than glass. "You were my best friend, my maid of honor, and all this time you were betraying me." The room fell silent, no one daring to move. His father's voice finally broke the stillness, trembling as he asked Daniel if it was true. Daniel sputtered, tried to twist the story, but I cut him off by sliding the bank statements across the table. Transfers from our joint account straight into Chloe's name. His mother gasped, tears welling in her eyes. Daniel lunged for the papers, but I pulled them back, smiling faintly. "Tomorrow, the court will see all of this," I said. "But tonight, I wanted you to know who your son really is." I gathered the folder, leaving only one photo behind, Daniel kissing Chloe, the timestamp glowing. Then I stood my chair, scraping softly against the floor. "Enjoy your meal." And I walked out. The silence I left behind was louder than any scream could have been. As I stepped into the night air, my heart didn't race, and my hands didn't shake. What I felt instead was something steadier. For months, I had carried the weight of their lies alone. Now the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. I didn't need to shout, and I didn't need to fight. I had already struck the first real blow, and they hadn't even begun to realize how deep it would cut. And with each step away from that house, I knew the breaking point had arrived. What came next wouldn't just unravel Daniel and Chloe's facade. It would strip them of everything they had built together on my back. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, a place where truth carried weight heavier than anyone's excuses. I sat beside my attorney, the folder of evidence resting between us like a shield I had sharpened for months. Daniel entered with Chloe close at his side, both of them trying to appear composed. He wore a dark suit, the kind he used to save for celebrations, but his hands betrayed him, tightening into fists before he forced them flat against the table. Chloe's eyes darted quickly toward mine, then away, her lips pressed too tightly together. When the judge entered the room, stilled, my attorney stood and began laying out the case. He spoke with precision, presenting photographs, bank statements, and receipts, each one marked and numbered. Images of Daniel stepping into Chloe's house, time-stamped for late nights he had sworn were spent at work. Hotel invoices with both their names, charges for rooms and meals for two. Transfers from our joint account directly into Chloe's. I kept my gaze forward, calm and steady, as the evidence stacked higher than any defense he could muster. Daniel's lawyer tried to object, claiming the photos could be misinterpreted, that receipts were circumstantial. The judge raised an eyebrow and said hotel bookings under two names were not circumstantial. Daniel shifted in his chair, a sheen of sweat rising on his forehead. Chloe kept her eyes on the table, her hands gripping the edge as though it could hold her upright. Then came the video, the final piece. Angela had captured Daniel entering Chloe's front door late at night, her porch light glowing like a beacon. The judge leaned forward and asked him directly if he denied the man in the video was him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, glancing at Chloe in panic. The silence that followed was louder than any denial could have been. The ruling came swiftly. The judge awarded me the house and the accounts, citing clear evidence of financial misconduct. Daniel was ordered to pay spousal support, a consequence of siphoning funds meant for our marriage into another woman's hands. The judge announced that Chloe's involvement in the transfers would be forwarded for investigation, her name tied to transactions she could not explain away. Chloe's head snapped up, her face draining of color. I didn't know she started, but Daniel gripped her arm hard and hissed at her to be quiet. The gavel struck sharp and final, sealing the truth into record. When court adjourned, the hallway outside filled with murmurs. Daniel cornered me near the doors, his voice breaking as he spat that I had ruined him. I leaned close, speaking quietly so only he could hear. No, Daniel, you ruined yourself. I only made sure everyone saw it. His eyes flared with rage. But beneath it, I saw fear. Fear of the life he could no longer control. I turned and walked past him, my heels clicking against the marble floor, leaving him standing alone in his defeat. That night, I walked back into the house that was now mine. The rooms were silent, steady, no longer heavy with secrets. I poured myself a glass of wine and set the court decree on the table, the words on the page proof of everything I had reclaimed. My phone buzzed, a message from Chloe. You think you've won? He'll come back to me. He always does. I stared at the words, then typed my reply slowly, each letter deliberate. Then you can pay his debts too. I set the phone down and drained my glass, the taste sharper than ever before. Within weeks, Daniel's world unraveled. He moved into a small apartment on the far edge of town, nothing like the home he once bragged about. The polished suits disappeared, replaced by clothes that no longer fit his image. His family stopped answering his calls. His mother, who had once proudly called him her golden boy, refused to speak to him. His sister told him not to come near her children's birthdays. The distance between him and the people who once admired him grew wider every day, leaving him with only Chloe at his side. But Chloe had her own storm. The bank froze her account, demanding answers for the funds transferred into her name. Investigators pressed her with questions she couldn't escape. She cried in meetings, claimed ignorance, swore she didn't know where the money came from. The paper trail told a different story. She called me late one night, her voice ragged, begging me to listen. They're saying I could lose everything, my job, my savings. Carolyn, please, you have to help me. I let her talk until her voice cracked, then spoke evenly. Now you know what it feels like to watch everything you've built disappear? She sobbed, tried to say she hadn't meant for it to go this far, but I ended the call without another word. That was the last time I ever heard her voice. Daniel tried to fight back through the courts, filing motions and appeals claiming I had manipulated evidence, claiming Chloe had lied. But the evidence was airtight. Each attempt was dismissed, each denial weaker than the last. Debt piled high, spousal support, legal fees, frozen assets. In the courthouse hallways, I heard Chloe snap at him, once her voice sharp and bitter. This is your fault. He turned on her just as vicious. My fault. You took the money. Their unity, once a weapon, now cracked in public for everyone to see. The affair that had once seemed so powerful collapsed under the weight of its own greed. They had built their fantasy on lies, and now those lies bound them together in shame. I watched from a distance, no longer with anger, but with clarity. Their destruction was not loud or sudden. It was steady, like a slow collapse of rotten beams. At home, I felt peace settle in for the first time in years. I walked through the rooms at night, without the heaviness in my chest, each space now mine, in truth, as well as in law. Neighbors whispered, but not about me. They whispered about Daniel, about how the man who once held himself above everyone else had been left with nothing. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for itself. And as the days stretched quiet and steady, I knew their downfall wasn't finished. The cracks had only just begun to spread, and soon their world would cave in completely. The final collapse was still coming, and I was ready to watch it fall. Daniel's downfall did not arrive like a storm. It came in pieces, slow and unrelenting, until there was nothing left of the man he once believed himself to be. After the ruling, he moved into a cramped apartment on the edge of town, the kind of place with peeling paint around the windows and thin walls that carried every sound. His polished suits looked out of place there, hanging in a closet that smelled faintly of damp wood. I heard from neighbors that he walked the streets late at night, head down, no longer the man who drew attention when he entered a room. His family, once his shield, turned their backs. His mother refused to answer his calls, the shame of his betrayal, too much for her to carry in the circles where she used to boast about her golden boy. His sister told him plainly not to show his face at family gatherings, not even birthdays. The silence from those who had always praised him cut deeper than my words ever could. It stripped him of the image he clung to, leaving him bare to his own failures. Chloe was no comfort to him. Her life crumbled even faster. The investigation into the financial transfers moved swiftly, and within weeks her accounts were frozen. She had grown accustomed to the gifts, the hotel stays, the easy money, but now every dollar was under scrutiny. I read her name in the paper one morning, listed in connection with fraudulent transfers. The article carried her photograph, the same smile she once used to mask her betrayal, now framed as evidence of complicity. The shame of it followed her into her office, into every whispered conversation among colleagues. She called me once more, her voice thin and desperate. "Carolyn, please," she sobbed. "You don't understand. I could lose everything." I let her speak, listened as her words spilled over themselves, excuses mixed with pleas. When her breathing hitched, I told her quietly that now she knew how it felt to watch life slip away piece by piece. She tried to apologize, but I ended the call. That was the last time her number appeared on my phone. Daniel tried to salvage what he could, filing motions insisting he deserved another hearing, claiming evidence had been twisted. Each attempt was struck down quickly. The evidence was too strong, too thorough. His debts piled high alimony court costs, the fees from every failed appeal. He began showing up to hearings with worn suits that no longer fit his face, drawn from sleepless nights. Once in the courthouse hallway, I watched him and Chloe hiss at each other in low, bitter tones. "This is your fault," she spat loud enough for others to hear. He snapped back, accusing her of taking what wasn't hers. Their alliance, once so smug, fractured in public, their whispered arguments echoing louder than they realized. The whispers spread quickly. Around town, people spoke of the man who had lost everything to his wife, the mistress who thought she had won, only to end up under investigation. I heard my name sometimes, but never in pity. It was Daniel and Chloe who carried the weight of the gossip, their reputations ground into dust. I didn't correct anyone. The truth was already written too clearly for words to change it. At home, I allowed myself to breathe again. I kept the house, walked through each room, without the heaviness pressing against me. I tended the yard, repainted the shutters, small acts that reminded me this space was mine in every way that mattered. I poured wine at the kitchen table and watched the sun dip behind the trees, the silence no longer a prison, but a comfort. The life I had rebuilt carried no shadows, only clarity. One evening, I opened the drawer where I kept the folder of evidence. The court decree rested on top, crisp and final. Beneath it, the photographs and receipts I had gathered so carefully. They were no longer needed, yet I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. They were proof not of what I had lost, but of what I had survived and reclaimed. I closed the drawer gently, knowing that the past no longer held me. Daniel, however, was still held by his. The last text I ever sent him carried only 3 words: "You underestimated me." He never replied, though I knew he read it. Perhaps he sat in that dim apartment, the walls pressing close, wondering how the woman he dismissed as naive had become the one to undo him completely. I didn't need to see him to know the truth. His world had collapsed piece by piece, and I had stood calmly as the weight of his choices dragged him under. Chloe faced her own reckoning, her name whispered in offices and printed in papers, her confidence shattered. And me, I stood free, not softened by forgiveness, not bound by bitterness, but steady in the knowledge that justice had been served. Yet I sensed their collapse was not finished. Debt shame and investigation would keep unraveling the threads they had clung to, and the final strands were yet to break. I didn't wait for it. I didn't need to. I had already walked away with everything they tried to steal. And as I leaned against the porch rail one quiet evening, the air cool and still, I knew the end of their story was already written. All that remained was to watch as the last of it fell away. The last text I sent to Daniel, those 3 simple words, "You underestimated me," was the final thread I allowed between us. No answer came, and none was needed. His silence was its own confession, one I carried with me like a closing door. From that moment on, I stopped waiting for apologies or explanations. I had already received something far better, proof that I could walk away with my head held high while he was left to face the wreckage of his choices. Life in the house changed in ways that surprised me. At first, it was just quiet, the kind that made you notice the ticking of a clock or the creak of floorboards in the evening. But soon, that quiet turned into peace. I repainted the shutters, planted flowers in the front yard, and opened the windows wide without worrying who was coming home late or who had just left. The air felt different, lighter. Each small change reminded me that I had reclaimed not only my space, but myself. I never heard much more about Chloe beyond what trickled through the papers. Investigators continued to press her about the transfers, and the company she worked for kept its distance. The confident friend, who once swept into every room with laughter, had been reduced to whispers and avoidance. Daniel remained in his small apartment, weighed down by debt and shame. His family, still cold and distant, no longer spoke his name in public. The two of them, once so proud of what they thought they had taken from me, were left to sit inside the ruins they created. For me, the victory wasn't about their misery. It was about the dignity I gained back when I refused to play the part they wrote for me. I didn't scream and I didn't beg. I gathered proof I planned carefully, and I trusted myself enough to see it through. When the gavel struck in that courtroom, it wasn't only a ruling in my favor. It was the sound of my voice being heard after too long of being dismissed. I've thought often about what betrayal really means. It's not just broken vows or secret meetings in the dark. It's the quiet erosion of trust, the assumption that you'll never notice, never rise, never fight back. Daniel and Chloe believed I would collapse under the weight of their lies. Instead, their betrayal gave me clarity. And with clarity, I found strength I didn't know I had. Justice, I learned, doesn't always come with shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the steady turning of pages, in the careful stacking of evidence, in the calm voice of a judge reading out the truth. And sometimes the best revenge isn't loud at all. It's simply living well unburdened while those who wronged you are left to sit in the shadows they created. Now, when I walk through my home, I don't see the reminders of a broken marriage. I see survival and renewal. I see evenings filled with peace instead of waiting. I see mornings where the coffee is poured without the weight of suspicion. I have no need to look back anymore. The past has done its work, and I've taken from it what I needed. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is that dignity is worth protecting, even when others try to strip it away. Silence, patience, and preparation can be more powerful than anger. And no matter how deeply someone betrays you, they cannot define the rest of your story. That choice belongs only to you. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey stayed with you the most. Share your reflections in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories like this one, stay connected here. Until next time, may you hold tight to your dignity and never forget your worth.